welcome to another episode of the Unwelcome Access Podcast. As always, I am your host, Ross Edelstein, and I am very tired today. I did not sleep last night. I'll probably be doing a episode soon on sleep, as the last few weeks have been perhaps not the best for that area of expertise. Not necessarily expertise, but of thinking. That said, I do want to have a few announcements here. First and foremost, one of the big things that I have wanted to do for a while, and I've finally gotten around to doing it, is to set up my podcast on all of the various podcasting services. So now we're on Apple Music, we're on Spotify, wherever you get your podcast, we're there. Automatically, this will be uploaded and put in as an audio podcast there. So I will have the links to Podbean, which is where it's sort of all being done through, down below, which will have links to that, as well as links on my Patreon and in the description. That said, I am really glad that I'm able to get this in whatever formats work for y'all. The transcripts will probably still be hosted on Patreon, which, if you like this content, please go ahead and subscribe there. Whether it's $1, whether it's for free, I don't really care. That's just the easiest place that I have to host things like the transcripts and the external documents that I might be sharing. Plus, also, it is a way to keep money flowing, especially right now. That said, today we are talking about food. And on the screen, we have a train picture, not a food picture. It's actually from a Valentine's Day train that I took with my fiance a couple years back. And the image there is very appropriate for the next slide, but that locomotive is a black locomotive with a green power car behind it and a red passenger car that is actually a dining car. We're talking about food today, and this is the obligatory trigger warning. I'll probably hit on some topics that, for some listeners, will be difficult. Things like, this is just a moment for you to disengage. Things like eating disorders and mental illness. Things that may not be the easiest to talk about, especially since food for some people can be a trigger. But that's something we're going to get into. Before we do that, though, it is time for story time with Ross. Now, as I mentioned, that last image with a locomotive and a whole train behind it is very appropriate because that's actually the locomotive I'm driving in this picture, not in the same image. This is a couple years after that first photo was taken. But it's the usual Storytime with Ross image. I'm driving a locomotive. I look absolutely pissed, but I'm having the time of my life. When we're talking about food, I have any number of stories I can tell. I worked fast food for years. But one of the things I really want to hit on here is less of a story, more of some experiences I've had. Now, one of the things that we're going to hit on here is autism and food. And a lot of people tend to associate autism and food with restrictive eating habits. And I have those. There are certain textures I cannot deal with. But I'm not a picky eater. The only things I'm picky about are sour cream, cream cheese, as long as it's not in a thing, just like cream cheese by itself, and certain cheeses. And even then, it's more of a scent than a texture. That being said, I bring this up because oftentimes it can go in the opposite direction, right? There are a lot of times where it's I cannot eat food due to a lack of flavor. Now, I'm going to refer you back to the autism episode. I think it turned out really well, but one of the things I talk about is over and under intensity. Bland food can lead to under intensity as much as it can lead to over intense, as food can lead to over intensity rather. Things like something being too spicy, well, something can also not be spicy enough. And actually, you'll see a lot of images of things I've cooked. I learned to cook in undergrad because the dorm food was basically inedible most of the time to me because of that lack of intensity. Also, just being dorm food. But my disability drove me to learn to cook. And that's sort of how I want to frame this. We're not talking about a specific way of interacting with food. We're talking about food as a general concept. And so this is going to be a little more free flow. I have only a couple slides here. So we're looking at maybe, a shorter episode, or it could be even longer. That said, let's talk a bit about disability models. Now, I actually have a really good example of it right here. So this is at my old Kentucky dinner train, which is essentially, so R.J. Corman essentially is what happens when you give a foamer a railroad. They do a lot of the track work for other railroads as well as operating their own short line, and they basically have this dinner train that they run. Again, this is another Valentine's Day train from 2023. And you can actually see a lot of that here. So when we're talking about disability models. Now, before I get into this, yes, these are historic trains. It's not a one-to-one. But you have the social model and the medical model. Social model, well, medical model we'll start with is disability is stored in the person. It is an effect of the person and needs to be changed at the person level. So in that case, we have all of these steps and then a ramp getting into the station building I'm in. And I'm taking a photo through the blinds here. But to each of these dining cars, you have to go up steps. Somebody who can't do that under the medical model, it's, well, obviously this is because you can't get up into the car, you can't do the steps, that's difficult, that's the barrier. Now, I'll also say these steps that they have, which are metal, pretty sturdy contraptions with handrails, far better than most railroads have for boarding, at least the tourist railroads, this kind of thing. Social model is disability is something a person has, but the disabling conditions are caused by societal choices. So this same example, they have an accessible car. The social model says, well, you've chosen to not make other cars accessible. Or, in my case, I look at this and say, well, because there is no support for making historic cars accessible, which if you are a railroad company or a railroad museum and want to talk about that, please, I would love to do that. That being said, the reality is there is no support for doing this, and it's really easy to hand wave away, well, it's historic, it doesn't have to be accessible, which, one, is not the truth. Two, saying, well, I don't have to do it, so I'm not going to, isn't that the same as just discriminating against someone anyway? That said, things are often more in the middle. In this case, there are accessible cars on this train. It is not that you can't participate in this experience. It's more a case of participating in this experience is going to be more difficult if that accessible car is full. So, why do I bring this up here? Food is a very social thing. And in fact, let's get into that. What is food? So, I have chosen 4 different food products that I think are a really good example of when we're talking about food as a social construct. Now, you might be looking at your screen or listening to me and just, Ross, what kind of academic bullshit are you on? Let me explain. Food is a universal thing for humans. We need it to eat, right? We need to eat to survive. That being said, we take food in very different ways. And what food is dependent on context. So, from left to right. On the far left, I wanted to have something that was not a positive food experience here. And even though this was fine, I would not have gotten this again. So, KFC a while ago, and I can't believe I'm having to say this in the podcast I do on disability. KFC had their chicken pizza, which was a fried chicken cutlet with pizza sauce, a sprinkling of cheese, and a couple of slices of pepperoni. And that's what you see here, as well as the soda I had that has the smiling face of Colonel Sanders. There are literally 3 slices of pepperoni, one of which is not on this chicken cutlet. There's only about a third to half of it that has any cheese or sauce on it, and that's unevenly distributed, and it looks like it's slid around in the box. It does not look very appetizing. I chose this because in this context, food is, well, somebody had the idea to put these things together for a fast food option. It is we are wanting to create something to sell to you and get your money, which the one on the right, which is a fiery mango Baja Dorito bag, which has a shark biting the Doritos logo and like a wave that is orange and has like a surfing chili pepper on it. It's interesting. That is also in there. Now these were also completely horrible, but I have made a pact with my fiance to try every Mountain Dew thing that exists. This is one of the things we started doing when we first started dating. This was not very good, but it's a way to sell a product, to get somebody to spend money. But it's also exploring a variety of flavors and trying to tell you, hey, this is what good food is. One of the big things that will come up again is that oftentimes when you're talking about selling food, you're often given this is a right or wrong way to experience it. And this often leads to effects around disability because social context. On the opposite end of the social context, from shitty KFC chicken pizzas and the abomination of fiery mango Baja Doritos, is a deconstructed seafood pot pie. So you have a big, puffy, golden brown puff pastry with a bunch of veggies in a sort of seafood, creamy seafood broth, and there's shrimp and scallops, and it's in a fancy plate, and it's garnished with herbs, and you can see some flaky salt on it, and just I'm going into all of this depth to describe it because this is one of the other things that food does. Food can scale from, is this really good and simple? Is this horrible? Is this something that I can get really easily, to this is a very classy restaurant that you're going for a Valentine's Day thing, and so you're going all in, and they're going to do stuff like deconstructing and using different ingredients than you might expect for a pot pie, which is typically thought of as a comfort food. Food can be playful and experimental, but it also can be over the top hoity toity. And the last one I have is from, why can't I remember the name? Jollibee. It completely escaped me. Jollibee is essentially, so the US did some colonialism in the Philippines. That is a whole other discussion for another day on that whole mess. But one of the things that the US sort of exported to the Philippines was fried chicken. That is one of the things that US soldiers brought over, especially, and other US related groups were bringing over, especially when you're looking at sort of the lead up to World War II, and then the sort of post war, the Philippines are free, but are sort of a de facto colony, even though they're not technically a US territory. Imperialism's a whole thing. But turns out people in the Philippines really liked fried chicken. And so Jollibee is essentially, let's create an American fried chicken restaurant in the Philippines. And this is chicken tenders and fries from Jollibee in Chicago, which is sort of it's come full circle. Now you can get the food that is essentially crossing cultural boundaries, which is the other part of food, right? It's universal, but we all interpret it under our own perspective. And so, even though this looks very familiar as chicken tenders, Jollibee also has, and you can see it very vaguely on the little clamshell that the food's in, they have a spaghetti meal because that's the cultural context. Now, these were some of the best chicken tenders I've had from a fast food place in my life. But the thing to remember is that, again, food crosses context, but it also is still affected by it. A chicken tender is a chicken tender is a chicken tender. But what I was getting for the chicken tender, the kinds of things that are expected, are going to be very different place to place, even if a chicken tender is a chicken tender is a chicken tender, typically. Food is one of those topics that there's no way for me to adequately give a full rundown. And again, Sleep and I have not been good friends. So I apologize if this is less coherent than usual. But I do want to get ahead and get into our first area, eating disorders. Now, I specifically did not choose a image of food for this one. And this is, I'm going to put in another trigger warning here. I am more going to be talking about things that might be triggering. But the image I have here is from the Strasbourg Railroad Museum for another eating train, this time a lunch train, with a steam locomotive coming through with the engineer and conductor waving while standing off the side, and there's a brick platform that it's going up along. It's got some old coach cars. It's great. It was a good time. I chose this because even though it's food related, it's not actual food, because this might be one of the harder areas for some people to listen to. But eating disorders and disordered eating more generally can come from a huge number of sources. We are, again, as I talk about with humans being very social creatures, but also being very contextual, how these things come out and play out are often super contextual. For example, a lot of eating disorders and are tied to gender, right? We often impose with gender norms, oh, a certain body type is what's going to be attractive to, in this case, the boys. Because usually the assumption is cisgender women need to look a certain way. And the pressures put on there by advertising, etc., can lead to essentially disabilities around mental health that are that come out as food related. But that doesn't mean that only cisgender women are affected, right? Anybody can get an eating disorder. All an eating disorder is that you are somehow altering through a means that is all an eating disorder is just an altered way of engaging with food. And that doesn't necessarily mean, oh, I just don't feel like eating 3 meals and have 2 big meals, or have like 5 small snacks through the day or whatever. This is more, I am actively impacting the food that is coming in. And when we talk about disorders generally, right, there is a difference between a difference and something that is a detrimental condition. Eating disorders, to rise to the level of having one, has to be causing you health impacts and has to be to the point where it is affecting your general health. So, anorexia is the first eating disorder. It's the most sort of well known one. And it's where we're going to start. But it's a great example. So, anorexia is characterized typically by restrictive eating habits. And by restrictive, I mean restrictive in terms of how much you're bringing into your body. So, usually this is associated with cheerleaders or other sort of beauty standards related life paths, where especially being thin is seen as a particularly wanted trait. And again, there are other contexts. I'm coming at this from the one that I know and live, a very Western context. But anorexia is essentially heavily limiting your caloric intake. Often it involves things like constantly weighing yourself, counting your calories to excess. And this is a great example of what I was saying with to rise to the level of being a eating disorder, it has to negatively impact your life. When you get to the level of being diagnosed with anorexia, in particular, it can impact things like your hair falls out, or your body is essentially so thin that you're going to be constantly cold, have poor circulation, and potentially have negative impacts from that. Anorexia can kill you. But it's, again, part of why I keep bringing up that it has to rise to that level to get the diagnosis, is that unlike a lot of other neurodivergence, and we'll come back to that in a slide in a moment, eating disorders really do have to have that negative impact because they're not just a difference, they are essentially your brain giving you instructions that are going to cause you harm. Similar, we have bulimia, which is characterized by binging and purging. So binging, and we'll talk about this as well in the next one on the list here, but is essentially ravenous food intake. Things like going to the buffet and getting 10 plates. But bulimia is sort of has that same insistence, right, on you're trying to look a certain way. So usually the binge eating is an attempt to cope with thoughts in your head. Food is a comfort for a lot of people, and eating a lot of food can be a comfort. Those same social factors, and again, often these are less a result of a person's sort of brain makeup and more socialization and the effects of that. But you're told, well, if you eat all this, you're going to get fat and be ugly and nobody's going to want to be with you. That can lead to a lot of guilt, which leads to the purging. Trigger warning again here. The purging is essentially making yourself vomit. It is, oh God, I've eaten all of this food. I cannot have it in my body. This can lead to a lot of similar outcomes as anorexia, but it also can really affect your teeth. Stomach acid, which comes out when you purge, that can negatively impact your teeth, your esophagus. It can cause a lot of damage to your throat. Plus, the methods by which you purge, whether they're chemical like medicine or more manual, can lead to negative outcomes up to and including death. Binge eating disorder is more along the lines of just that overindulgence in food to the point of making yourself sick and being unable to control that. Again, there is nothing wrong with being on the chubbier side or liking food or eating a lot of food. Binge eating disorder can cause issues when it gets to the point of you are eating enough to make yourself sick in a single sitting. Or you're basically overindulging to the point where it is causing other health impacts. This isn't to say that you can't be healthy and a larger person. I think I'm pretty healthy, and again, I'm on the chubbier side. What I'm talking about is you have essentially made yourself unable to do the things you want to do. Or you've basically made yourself have, in the span of months or a couple years, essentially you've lost the chance to participate in society. Again, this isn't if you get fat, you're going to, have a bad outcome in life. This is, if you are doing it to excess every time you eat, that's where the issue is, because that is where you start to get things like, again, making yourself sick from how much you're eating, but also the overeating and inability to stop eating. there are that often can come from neurodivergence too, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But binge eating disorder is one of those that, again, especially when you have companies and advertisements at the same time as they're enforcing the sort of body standards that can lead to anorexia and bulimia, they're also telling you buy, eat, consume all of what we're giving you. And so that can lead to some of these outcomes too. Now, the next one is also a neurodivergent trait, but it can also just be an eating disorder itself. It is also one of the less social ones, but avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. Essentially, this is you are limited to the number and types of food you will eat for whatever reason. This can be due to trauma. This can be due to being autistic. We'll talk about that in a moment. This can be due to any number of reasons. This isn't just being a picky eater. And that's one of, again, so often food and eating disorders are trivialized, which can make getting help and treatment really difficult. ARFID, ARFID, which is the initials for avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, which is what I will be referring to now, ARFID. But ARFID is often characterized as, oh, they're just a picky eater. The reality is, for someone with ARFID eating a food that they cannot eat, it's not just, oh, I don't like this and I don't want to eat it. It's, dear God, this is torture to eat. Again, it is not just being picky. It is to the point where you are limiting the nutritional intake you can get. And nutrition is a whole other thing, especially when you talk about lobbying and how that created things like the food pyramid, which has grains at the bottom, and other things like that. But essentially, you still have a certain need for vitamins, minerals, etc., which a lot of people they can be hard to get those just generally. Look at the multivitamin industry. But when you're talking about ARFID, that adds to it. If the only thing someone's willing to eat is chicken tenders, there's a lot of nutrients that they're not going to get out of just a chicken tender. That being said, I'm going to go ahead and give it to Ross of the future, or the past, to do our ad read. Take it away. Wow, Future Ross, what a great ad. Or maybe there isn't one. As always, our primary sponsor is you, the viewer, over on patreon.com/unwelcomeaccess. However, this space is intentionally left open for disabled people who have a project, a business, something they want to get out there to help platform people who might not otherwise get a chance to share in this sort of format. That said, back to your regular programming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. Thank you, Ross of the future/past. Again, really appreciate everyone who's participated in the Patreon. Feel free to join if you want. But let's talk about food allergies. It's another area where you have a lot of minimization. I don't know why this picture is sideways, but it is. So we have, again, train-related food. This is the Amtrak French toast. You've got some French toast, some strawberries, whipped cream, sausage on the Amtrak plate, and there's some apple juice sort of off in the background. I chose this because there's a lot of ingredients people can be allergic to in this particular dish. And a lot of them are ones that people don't always assume are going to be an allergy. Now, I have on here that a food allergy is being allergic to food. Now that I have given you that world-shattering information, food allergies can range from mild to life-threatening to a intolerance to, dear God, this is about to kill me. And it can be any food. Now, you have things like peanuts and tree nuts that are the sort of, oh, this is the common one, this is the poster child of food allergies. But those are not the only things. On this plate, you can be allergic to meat. And I'm not talking about you're just not used to it if you've gone vegan or vegetarian. I'm talking about allergic to meat. You could also be allergic to dairy. And I'm not, again, lactose intolerance should be treated seriously. But I'm talking about actual allergies to milk proteins. You can be allergic to strawberries. Same deal there. You can be allergic to gluten. And not just in, and that's anything from, again, just making your stomach hurt to this will kill me if I have it. Also, wheat. Wheat allergies exist, and that's what French toast is. These food allergies are a extremely common disability, and oftentimes they are treated as an inconvenience to anybody who is not the person who has them. Oh, I, well, there's a lot of times that they're not taken seriously due to somebody having past experience with false claims. One of the things I'm going to recommend to any viewer, treat someone seriously even if somebody is obviously lying. Because you don't always know that they're lying because lying is a very social thing. Not everybody is socialized the same way as you. That said, a lot of these false claims come from anywhere from being embarrassed that you're picky to, remember what I talked about with ARFID and being labeled a picky eater, even though it is actually physically painful to eat a certain thing? It's a lot easier to get someone to take a food allergy seriously when you're saying this might kill me than having to explain that eating a strawberry will make you feel like you're dying. It sucks that people have to do that, but on the other side, a lot of this not taking it seriously leads to people getting hurt or dying. If you go on Reddit's various Am I the Asshole subreddits, you will see plenty of stories of parents, in-laws, whoever, saying, oh, I don't actually believe that your kid or you have this allergy that has put you in the hospital 5 times. So I'm going to sneak it into your food. Wait, why are you cutting contact with me when I tried to kill you? I didn't actually know I was going to kill you. I thought you were lying. Oftentimes, again, it's that social element, right? Food allergies, even if they are very much a medical thing, the barrier to a food allergy is, especially when you're talking about, Amtrak's actually really good about this with saying what is the food that you're having. But for a lot of places, you don't know if there's, say, a wheat product there. You don't necessarily know, is there something that I can't eat? Now, labeling has gotten a lot better about this lately. But that often leads to a barrier because oftentimes people will lie. There are also stories of, hey, the waitress said, yeah, this doesn't have any, there's no strawberries in this. And the food comes out and there's a strawberry right on top there. The reality is that the food that people are given, you don't always know if somebody is being honest with you, and that can lead to barriers. Neurodivergence. So this is the one that I think the autism sampler platter, which is dino nuggies, pretzels, mozzarella sticks, chicken nuggets, just regular ones, letter fries, waffles, smiley potatoes, a pepperoni pizza, and SpaghettiOs. But the caption there says, "Babe, what's wrong? You've barely touched your autism sampler platter." Neurodivergence can lead to a lot of food issues. So go back to the autism episode. I talk a lot about this there at sort of the general level. But it's essential. One of the big things that neurodivergence can cause is a difference in how you engage with the senses. Taste, texture, smell, all big with food. And so that can lead to things like a lot of autistic people have ARFID. Not necessarily due to a more social concern, like, for example, there's a traumatic memory with beans, and so you can't eat beans ever. But, oh my god, it feels like I'm dying if I eat the wrong food. But that's not the only reason, right? That's the most easy to point to reason, because that is a very medicalized way of thinking about it, right? It's, oh, autistic people obviously are doing this because of those physical things that are just a effect of them. No, that is not the case in actually most cases with neurodivergent people. Executive function, something I do not have. Jokes aside, it's essentially the concept of you have a ability as a human being to set yourself on a task. It is essentially the ability to prioritize, to make lists, to handle changes, etc. It's a wide, wide range of things, and it should be its own episode, and probably will be. But executive function is often something that folks with neurodivergence have struggles with. It is really hard for me to stay on task and to switch between tasks because of my particular executive function barriers. I'm also still expected to, go out and perform and record this podcast and edit the podcast and also go and drive to conferences. Next week I'm presenting 3 times at one. Well, not presenting, but participating for 3 days and doing things every day. And I'm, expected to engage with friends and so on and so forth. All of that takes a lot of energy. And my autistic ass struggles with that and struggles with having the brain function to create food. I can cook. In fact, you'll see some food pictures of mine pretty soon here. Oftentimes, I just do not have the energy or the capacity to do it. Now, the other part is that, along with executive function, there's overwhelm. Go back to the autism episode, but the world can be overwhelming. And when you're overwhelmed, you're much more susceptible to all of those various sensory things and also having less executive function. So you often lead into a safe food. Now, this is also a thing with ARFID, but a safe food is essentially a food that, no matter the circumstances, you can eat it. The autism sampler platter, is all safe foods, or traditionally safe foods. These are things that no matter what, you know what you're going to get. When you're overwhelmed, you know what a chicken nugget is going to be like. Even if you're cooking your own chicken nuggets, like breading it and frying it, you are not going to be overwhelmed by new tastes, textures, smells, whatever. You know what that process is going to be. And so oftentimes, it can lead to those safe foods being what somebody is looking for. And so oftentimes this can create barriers, right? Somebody is going out to eat and after a social event and recommends a new restaurant. And it's of a cuisine that isn't really common in your area. Well, you'd love to try it, but you're just out socializing for 4 or 5 hours. And you're overwhelmed and you need something that is easy. All of a sudden, you look like the bad guy because you're not going along with the plan to go to the cool, trendy restaurant, but you don't know if there's something that you're going to be able to eat. Again, for all my non-neurodivergent audience members, just be understanding and don't take somebody saying, hey, I need something I can eat as necessarily a reason not to either A, invite them again to other things, or B, not make a plan to go to that restaurant in the first place next time. Oftentimes that overwhelm can be helped if you have a plan. But the other one is compulsion. So when I say compulsion, a lot of various neurodivergences have that there's the little voice in your head that is telling you, you have to do this thing now. OCD is the biggest one, right? Where it's, I have to perform a certain ritual. Food can have compulsions too. Binge eating disorder is often a compulsion. Now, to what point disabilities of mental health and your more born with it types of neurodivergence overlap, I don't think we'll ever know. But a disability of mental health is still a neurodivergence. And the compulsion can exist in all kinds of ways. For example, you could have a food compulsion that's every time something good happens, there's a specific restaurant and meal you go to. And if you don't do that, you haven't actually had something good happen. The reason I bring it up here is that all of these are not necessarily going to be life-threatening. They can cause you worse outcomes, especially when you're talking about safe foods and ARFID related to these neurodivergent things. But they don't have to, in the same way that eating disorders, to be officially diagnosed with them, you really need to be having those, this is also affecting my ability to engage with the world how I want to. The compulsion can get bad, right? If there are rituals before eating you might have if, say, you have OCD, or if you're autistic and you just straight up are compelled to only eat certain foods at certain times because that is your ritual. These don't necessarily mean that you are having those same negative health outcomes. A lot of the negativity around those is due to the behavior of others. Let's move on though. Physical concerns. So I have a good example here. One of my favorite restaurants of all time is Superdog in Chicago. Just got actually voted best hot dog in the city. Now here I have a burger, comedic timing aside, as well as a chocolate soda. And actually that's going to bring up another concern here in a moment that I probably should have written in. But you have a burger, you have fries, you have your chocolate super soda, and you're at a blue picnic bench. Just a regular plain old picnic bench. And it's not accessible. Now, the built environment can often be a barrier to eating and can lead to some of these negative food-related outcomes. So, a lot of restaurants are not accessible, or they'll say they're accessible, but then they're organized in a way that really isn't. Look at every restaurant that only has iPads. If your restaurant, and you're watching this, has an iPad as your menu, find an accessible way to do it, because a blind person can't engage with that. Also, restaurants not having things like menus online. That can often, or even if you don't have a permanent menu, give some examples of the kinds of things you have. But the built environment can basically lead to people not coming and having a good time, or just not being able to get in there at all. Other examples include every restaurant that has that trendy, open ceiling, lofty, industrial converted space vibe. That's a recipe for sound bounce, and any moderate fill of the restaurant basically having overwhelming levels of sound, as well as the fact that everywhere has their music too damn loud. And I'm not just saying this as old man Ross, but literally radio and streaming services tell businesses this is how loud it needs to be for this space, and it's too loud to get people to listen to the ads. But restaurants are not the only place, right? Now, I have a picnic table here. There's a whole set of, this is what an accessible picnic table looks like. This was not an accessible picnic table, and you could have made it accessible actually relatively easy by taking out just one of the benches. But also this applies at home. So one of the failings of the ADA, still the best accessibility law in the world, the biggest failing is that it does not impact home building. And part of that is US perspectives on property law. This is going to be a whole other episode, I promise. But there's no mandate on having accessible houses or apartments if you are not covered by Federal Housing Administration money. So your HUD housing, Housing and Urban Development, Fair Housing Act, covered entities, and some state laws. I just looked at California, and they're a good example of this, will have requirements for this. But if you have a physical disability, especially if you're a chair user, your ability to engage with your kitchen is going to be a lot different than if you, say, are somebody who can stand and cook normally. In fact, if you have to take constant breaks, that's going to impact the way that you are able to cook at home. Let's talk about eating, though. Well, drinking to start. One of the big things with the switch away from straws has been, especially for those who are perhaps not doing this out of the most kindness of their heart, one of the reasons that people have railed against moving away from plastic straws is that they're less accessible. Or rather, the alternates are less accessible. Especially when you're talking about a paper drinking straw that might degrade and make it require more force to suck out of, or a metal straw that someone with a seizure disorder or inability to really control their jaw might bite and hurt their teeth. Those are valid. Those are also usually straw man arguments that are used against it, and not necessarily actually derived from talking to disabled people. You can get really good examples of straws, but people do need a straw in a lot of cases. And taking away that option without coming up with something that's better, and I've seen some actually really good corn-based biodegradable plastics that are basically identical but are compostable. Also things like, I forget what it is, but using, say, plants that do have a hollow center as a straw. That's also good. But also, straws are a minimal thing when you're talking about the rest of the plastic cup. again, a lot of the discussion there is very performative, and oftentimes it can lead to more barriers, not necessarily because of the argument itself, but because people are being called as the reason to or to not do the thing, and whoever's on the other side now has a negative perspective on disabled people. Moral of the story, don't talk about us unless you're actually working with the community or have taken time to know what people who actually live it are saying. That said, I want to talk about one of my favorite brand stories, OXO Good Grips. So, arthritis is a very common disability, essentially joint inflammation, usually affects older folks. OXO Good Grips was, hey, a lot of people are struggling to cook because tools are not ergonomic. Let's provide more ergonomic options that do not require the same level of force, or they have more comfortable grips. And it's one of those products that turns out everybody loves those products, even though they were intended as accessibility tools. Now, there's other adaptive cooking equipment, which might be an interesting episode to do at some point in the future as a future assistive tech bit. But OXO Good Grips is the one that most people have run into, and I bet a lot of you listening have something from them in your home. I also want to talk a little bit about digestion. I'm not sure why I put this in there, I'll be completely honest. But a lot of the food that we have in this country, the US at least, can be difficult to digest, whether it's you have IBS and food irritates you, or you have an intolerance to lactose, which a lot of people do. Oftentimes, the things you eat can cause issues in your body. It can be really hard to know what does and doesn't. That said, again, I don't remember what I would put that in there for. So let's go on to cooking. So this is a photo of mine. Autism be damned, boy can grill. I have several burgers, including a couple that have cheese on them. Flame on a flaming grill. And here I'm really talking about not what most people think of when we're talking about cooking. I'm talking about intellectual and developmental disabilities. So one of the areas, so intellectual and developmental disabilities, intellectual disability, but also things like autism, ADHD, Down syndrome, your sort of broad spectrum of this affects these developmental spaces as well as into adulthood, day-to-day considerations. Now, intellectual disability can come in any type of way and across a whole spectrum. Same with autism, Down syndrome, etc. But oftentimes cooking is an area that people simply are not given the skills in. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this. First of all, measuring and following those steps and instructions can be difficult, especially when those measurements might not be intuitive and the tools might not always be intuitive. Sure, a measuring spoon. That's a really intuitive tool if you're taught how to use it. And especially in the US, where we're using all kinds of wacky measurements, tablespoon versus teaspoon versus whatever, the measurements can be their own barrier, especially when you have to try to remember your conversions. Following the instructions can also be difficult, and not necessarily because this isn't saying folks with IDD can't follow instructions. It's as much, oh, the steps and instructions require a specific technical jargon. And I will be doing a plain language episode at some point, but oftentimes that jargon might not be something someone knows immediately or hasn't been exposed to. Or the steps might be, sure, you've gone to foodnetwork.com and it has 3 steps in the recipe. But the celebrity chef that wrote it 20 years ago had actually 12 sub-steps per part, so it's actually a lot more complicated to follow. And I will say, I've dealt with a lot of recipes like that, where this looks like it's easy, it's just 3 steps, but also the sub-steps in there, and there's not well-explained sub-steps. But also developing those skills, right? Oftentimes there's a fear. I made the autism be damned, my boy can grill joke because often there's a fear that someone is going to burn down the house. Now, I'll say I've only once almost burnt down a house. This is a true story. So when I was in undergrad and working at Taco Bell, there was a summer that I was staying in Kirksville working and doing an internship. I called this place the Taco Bell Trap House. That is a whole story for another day. But I was having some issues with, one, not having hot water, not having air conditioning, and also not having enough money. I was constantly being cut because capitalism. Essentially, even though it was the most profitable store by a long shot, actually giving people hours over the summer when there weren't college students, unthinkable. That makes the line go down or not go up as much. I bring this up because it made me tired. It made me have less of that executive function. And so I forgot to put water in my Easy Mac. And let's just say the kitchen was smoky for the rest of my time there. But that is a fear that a lot of people have. Now, I will add, I lived in the dorm for 4 years. There was at least twice every year that somebody did that in one of the microwaves. And not somebody who was neurodivergent. But there's a fear that cooking will cause damage. Knives. They can be dangerous. You have to have knife skills. Fire can be dangerous. Leaving the oven on. All these things. And so a lot of people, especially well-meaning parents, make the assumption, I shouldn't be letting them around this. For some people, that's true. For most, that isn't. And so specialized, especially if you don't feel comfortable teaching somebody, specialized courses exist. And heck, you can ask for them in special education as a life skills course. Even just getting somebody to engage with cooking and doing simple things from day one, that gets you a lot farther and helps develop those skills. It might take longer to do so, but it's not impossible. The other big support is adaptive cookbooks. Oftentimes, these adaptive cookbooks have simpler layouts for the recipes, much less jargon. A lot of the time, they are also simpler recipes to start with, because the intention is often to help develop these skills. Now, not every adaptive cookbook is built the same. I don't have any specific recommendations because, again, the support here is very individual. But there are supports that do exist like that. Now, last thing I want to hit is the DoorDash discourse. I've written out discourse because I think that there's a lot of things that the internet talks about that are just stupid. This is one of those. So every time, feels like at least 2 or 3 times a year, somebody posts about getting food from somewhere quick, complaining about DoorDash, and so on. Now, there are a lot of things that are wrong with DoorDash. It's stupid expensive. The customer service has gotten really bad. And also, in a lot of cases, the food quality is a lot worse than if you went and picked it up yourself. But let's go back a couple of slides, right? Executive function. Safe foods. Overwhelm. These are the core of this slide. But also, your home kitchen as a barrier. And restaurant physical environments being a barrier too, right? One of the big barriers to participation in food culture is often things like, oh, I don't have time to cook for myself. I don't have the energy to cook for myself. I had to take what I could get for an accessible house, and the kitchen really isn't accessible for me. Now, there are ridiculous amounts of getting DoorDash, especially in this economy, but also ridiculous, oh, this is right here. I could go and get it quickly for able-bodied people. And when I say able-bodied, I mean the whole body-mind system being in a normative way. And especially for someone who it's just laziness, even though they live above the restaurant or whatever. Those are a lot rarer than, hey, I'm disabled and do not have the time, energy, or ability to get to the restaurant. In fact, a lot of restaurants that didn't do delivery before, people have been able to try them. And it also has allowed for things like people being able to try them with friends. You could get people together if you couldn't go to the restaurant and try it from the comfort and safety of your own home. Also, sometimes there's only one thing that you are able to eat. Like, you have the one thing that is what you need to be eating for whatever reason. And it might just be McDonald's chicken nuggets. And so you're going to order McDonald's chicken nuggets because you are overwhelmed, and that is the food that is safe for you right now. DoorDash should still be destroyed, don't get me wrong. But do not fault disabled people for using the tools at their disposal in our current system. Even though it's abusive as a system, especially DoorDash, most disabled people are aware of this. Heck, a lot of disabled people are DoorDashers. There is no barrier, and we'll do this whenever I actually do the employment episode. The barriers to getting a job do not exist for DoorDash. Now, it would be nice if we could get rid of all those barriers without any sort of how do I phrase this? It'd be nice to get rid of all those barriers without, it'd be nice to get rid of all those barriers and have services like this that do not abuse workers. Most disabled people are giving at least a decent tip. because they're aware. And honestly, in the current system and with our current uh, government, things are going to have a lot more people using these services for basic income. And so, as of right now, as much as I'd like to destroy DoorDash, it's a necessary evil. That being said, again, thank you all for watching. I know this has been a little bit more loose of an episode than usually I do, but it was fun and covered a whole wide variety of topics here. And let me know if you have any thoughts in the comments below. Love to hear from you, and feel free to share this. And again, let me know if you're listening to this on a service that is not YouTube. Thank you all for watching. Hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next episode. A huge shout out to the wonderful people over on Patreon who are helping to make this project happen. As always, we aren't getting any ad revenue from YouTube, and we also aren't. You'll also get your name up on the screen right about now, like these lovely people who have helped support the podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to our next episode. Unwelcome Access is a production of Autism, a disability and accessibility consulting organization.